I'm ready. Whenever you are done, you just let me know. I will start.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So let's start. Good evening and a warm namaskar to all. I am Mariam, representing Voices from the Periphery, and it is both an honor and a joy to welcome you to today's lecture, Debating Multiculturalism Select Perspectives. Today, we were graced by the presence of Professor Shibashis Chatterjee, a distinguished scholar from the Department of International Relations at Jadavpur University, Kolkata, with decades devoted to research and wealth of participations, Professor Chatterjee brings a rare depth of understanding to the historical, political, and profoundly human dimensions of multiculturalism. His works, like India's Special Imaginations of South Asia and Nuclear Non-Proliferation and the Problems of the Threshold States, reveal his nuanced grasp of the intricacies that shape our world. He also serves as the co-editor of Peace and Conflict Studies, Perspectives from South Asia. Professor Chatterjee, we are truly privileged to have you with us today. Thank you, sir, for joining us. With that, sir, up to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you, sir.
much. Ayush, I can see you because all the correspondence, in fact, has been with you. So, can you just tell me that how long should I speak? Uh, is it okay if I speak for an hour?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Usually, sir, our lectures held 1 hour to 1.5 an hour.
Yeah. So let me speak for about an hour so that we can have some discussion, right?
Yes, sir, of course.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
that will be good, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much. So I welcome everybody, this evening to discuss multiculturalism. Uh, Multiculturalism has always been, a very significant and a very fascinating, I would say, topic, in fact, to discuss. Because of the fact that multiculturalism is both a fact of the world, but at the same time, multiculturalism, in fact, is under threat. And when I say that it is under threat not only in the classical centers of multiculturalism, the classical bastions of multiculturalism, which in fact would be the classical immigration countries that we have. But multiculturalism, in fact, is now questioned virtually in diverse parts of the world. Now, let me explain. The first thing, in fact, is that look, in some sense, the world is automatically multicultural by virtue of the fact that in every country you would find that there are different groups who, in fact, live. And these groups, in fact, they differ from one another, by virtue of various social identities, collective social identities that one might think of. So groups would vary in terms of the languages they speak, groups might vary in terms of the ethnicity that they have, groups might vary in terms of the religion that they belong to, and the axis of differences, in fact, therefore, may be many. And some of these differences, in fact, may be complex and complicated, cross cutting, which in fact add more dimensions of complexity to the equation. But nonetheless, the basic fact is that virtually every society that you look at, in fact, would be in some sense empirically multicultural. But this empirical multiculturalism is not to be confused with what theoretically we understand as multiculturalism, because it is something which is very deeply normative. Okay, I mean, so therefore, in other words, the very fact that most societies are multicultural does not automatically mean that there is a natural commitment, let's say, to multiculturalism across the world, or there had been such a commitment in many parts of the world for a considerably long period of time. In fact, to make things, I think, straight, The first thing, in fact, is this, that the movement towards multiculturalism, in fact, can be identified from the 1970s, when the impact of new waves of immigration, which is post Second World War immigration, in fact, were began to be felt in the classical immigration countries. And by the classical immigration states, in fact, the examples that come to one's mind would be Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and some of the West European countries, which in fact are not classical immigration countries, because they always had, their own national population, in fact, which means, which did not come into being through settler, colonies, but they gradually, these countries, their demographic profiles also began to gradually change because of the waves of immigration that in fact would happen. So I would first ask you to be historically a little bit conscious, and sort of, understand the very historicity of the concept, and why the historicity is, in fact, is very critical and significant. Is because that, look, multiculturalism, in a way, in fact, this whole debate comes up in a context of immigration of people who, in fact, could not be fully assimilated into the host societies that they had come. Now, this is an important point, because if you look at the, settler colonies, like if you look at Canada, if you look at the United States, you look at Australia, New Zealand, such countries, you would find, what you would find, that the white settler colonies, in fact, had been formed in these new parts of the world, and they had gradually, in a way, attracted waves of white immigration. Okay, I mean, so whether you were looking at Canada or Australia or the US, you would find that waves of immigration, in fact, took place. Now, mostly, if you look at Canada, the majority of the white population who immigrated to Canada were either British or French. If you look at the US, in addition to British, there were waves of migration by the Italians, by the Germans, but then gradually people, from the Central European republics, many of these people who in fact were white people, they migrated to the US. In Australia, New Zealand, mostly the British in fact had migrated, with a small number of other European migration. But the important point is, the moot point is, that this immigration, in fact, and the making of the settler colonies was white. And so therefore the problem, in fact, is this, that if you look closely, that the making of these societies, in fact, had very, in a sense, being the making of white societies. Okay, I mean, and in that context, the question of multiculturalism did not arise. Now, the question of multiculturalism, in fact, comes up when, from the, after Second World War, gradually the pattern of migration, in fact, begins to change. Okay, I mean, and so therefore the pattern of migration, when you say begins to change, it means what it means, that Asians and Africans, in fact, gradually begin to move now, and they begin to settle in these immigration societies in pretty large numbers. Okay, and as their numbers increase, significant new questions, in fact, they come up. And questions that come up, in fact, would very broadly be, not only economic questions were, by the way, important, but they were also significantly cultural questions, because the whole question, in fact, was that these new people, in fact, they demanded cultural, what you call, membership. But while they demanded cultural membership, and they were also granted citizenship, but the whole idea, in fact, was that could they really become citizens in the way, or in the manner in which the white Europeans, in fact, were citizens. In other words, that could these people be assimilated? And the general consensus of the white societies, in fact, was this, that these people, in fact, had come with very different kinds of culture, and their ideologies, predispositions, in fact, began to be very different from the whites, and therefore they were not fit for assimilation. So therefore they could not be assimilated. Not only, they could not be assimilated, but there was also this idea that they should not be assimilated, but they needed to be integrated into the society. So the challenge, in fact, was that how would these populations, who in fact were very different from the white settler populations in the immigration countries, be made a part of the society so that the society would remain stable, and therefore the major economic, political, as well as cultural tasks could be performed without any difficulty. So this in fact is very broadly what you call the moment of multiculturalism, or this is the historicity of multiculturalism. I just wish to emphasize the point that, look, and I'm going to talk about this a little late, that the first initial I would say the first initial moment, in fact, is the realization that we now have a society where there is a lot more diversity and variety. And this diversity and variety, in fact, had to be politically, accommodated, or it had to be politically navigated, negotiated, and how do we do it? Now, very broadly, the nature of the debate, multiculturalism is a very broad, substantive topic. Okay, I mean, and many lectures, in fact, would be needed to cover all the dimensions, let's say, of multiculturalism, which obviously is not possible, and I don't think it is also a nice way of looking at it. But what I would have to therefore do is that I would have to what exactly is the theoretical debate about, and what really are the major points of contention. And I would like to end by looking at the multiculturalism in contemporary times. But the lecture is going to be, because I look at it theoretically, the lecture is going to be a theoretical one, and the the examples which would make you understand the major theoretical arguments. So the first thing, in fact, is that, look, if you look closely to multiculturalism, in fact, is debatable because of many, what you call, internal divisions. The most major division, in fact, is that does multiculturalism actually require a liberal frame, or multiculturalism, in fact, has to go beyond liberalism? In other words, the basic fundamental debate has always been that does multiculturalism, in fact, require a liberal, what you call political system, or a liberal frame of analysis, or we need to go beyond liberalism in order to be genuinely multicultural. So in other words, I mean, there are issues which in fact are issues of cultural, universalism and cultural relativism. There are issues of, very broadly speaking, moderate multiculturalism and radical multiculturalism. There are also issues of to what extent multiculturalism in fact can be replicated in societies which in fact have very unique characters, and to what extent multiculturalism in fact can be extended across the world. So these in fact are all parts of the debate that in fact has gone on for a very long period of time. And these in fact would, in a sense, create a kind of a context, let's say, of what we are discussing. And I would want you to remember that these in fact are the essential elements that had never been out of focus. These had never gone both the theory and practice of multiculturalism, or the onset and the retreat, possibly a better way of looking at it, or putting it in fact, is of multiculturalism. But these elements that I've just narrated, right now, these elements in fact remain constant to the debate, and I would very broadly talk about multiculturalism in the remaining time by focusing on some of these issues. Now, the first thing, in fact, that I need to talk about, in fact, is the making of the citizen. And the making of the citizen is absolutely essential as a precondition to multiculturalism, because without the understanding of the conventional theory of citizenship, we just cannot begin multiculturalism in any way. Now, the conventional understanding of multiculturalism, or the conventional understanding of citizenship, in fact, begins with the project of integration. So citizenship was always meant to create a body of people, to create a body of demography, which in fact would be united and who in fact would have allegiance to the state. Now, all of you must be knowing this, okay? I mean, and because this is such a commonsensical thing, if you ask me, that there is a distinction, between the state on the one hand and the nation on the other. Okay, I mean, look, if you look closely to the idea of the state, in fact, is an aggregation of institutions. Okay, I mean, and it is in a way sort of defined as an institution that has the capacity to exercise legitimate violence in society, which obviously is a Weberian way of looking at it, a Hobbesian way of looking at it. And although the notion of the state, in fact, has evolved over time, but generally there's not really been much of a shift, let's say, in the understanding of the state, which is very broadly that the state, in fact, is an aggregation of a set of institutions. Now, the fact is that for people, identifying with the state automatically has never been very easy. In other words, that, I mean, you could be turned into citizens through the political action of the state, and this is the story of citizenship. But it does not automatically follow that you would, genuinely be able to have a fondness, a liking, or some kind of attachment to the state. And this brings into, existence another concept, which in fact is a concept which is the other part of the equation to the modern state, which is that of the nation. And so, therefore, when you are looking at the idea of the citizen is a kind of a hyphen between the state on the one hand and the nation on the other. So, there is this idea that the attachment, let's say, that people, have with the state can only happen provided they have a sense of, nationalism in them. Without a sense of nationalism, without a sense of national identity, this whole idea of citizenship, in fact, would not happen. Now, this national identity or this idea of integrated citizen, in fact, was forged over a period of 300 years, and the historical context, in fact, is the breakdown of the feudal order. Now, the feudal order, was a highly stratified, differentiated system in which people, in fact, were divided by irrational prejudices of groups of class and various other sociological differences that you could think of. There was also no one legal system. Okay, I mean, there was no one law, and there was no conception of equal, legal rights under the feudal system or in a feudal order. So when we gradually, come into the next phase, which is capitalism, there was an economic necessity under capitalism, in fact, to get into a new system where people, in fact, would have, equal juridical right, so that the right to contract and the right to property, in fact, would be turned into, enforceable legal rights in a given society. And this necessitated or this resulted in the first wave of citizenship rights, which in fact were civic rights. And civic rights were a very important, moment in the history of the making of the modern citizen, because what they did, in fact, was that they, for the first time, provided equal legal rights and certain equal civic rights to the people. Now, the project was obviously incomplete, but nonetheless, for the first time, a sense of unity began to grow within a given national, population, that people, in fact, began to feel that they are no longer, horizontally divided, but or vertically divided for that matter, but they have now come to share a set of common, legal rights or a set of common civic rights. But the problem with the common civic rights and common, what I would call legal rights, in fact, was this, that legal rights, are formal in nature, but more importantly, if you pay attention to civic rights, you find that civic rights, they tend to provide much more attention to the individual's capacity to exercise the right. So, in other words, if you look at your right to religion, it is your right to religion. Your right to speech, it is your right to speech. So, therefore, it in a sense automatically, encourages a culture of individualism, which was also very much needed by, the growing liberal capitalist order, because unless a sense of individualism, in fact, grew, capitalism as an economic system would not perform well, or it would not really flourish. So the flourishing of capitalism necessitated this idea of individualism, and civic rights obviously added on to it. Okay, I mean it encouraged this idea of individualism. Now, in the next century, which is in the 19th century, there was a realization that people, in fact, did not achieve the necessary level of integration by only having civic rights. So this led to the next generation of rights, which in fact were the political rights. Okay, and these waves of rights, when we are discussing the work of T.H. Marshall, who in fact was one of the leading political sociologists, and his work is based on the evolution of citizenship in Britain, but the story, the narrative, in fact, is extendable to the making of the modern citizen in and across the Western world. So very broadly, the next phase, in fact, was the making of the political citizen through the grant of the universal adult suffrage. But all of you know this, I am absolutely sure, that the history of the universal adult suffrage, in fact, is again a history which is, one of struggle, one of contestation. It did not happen at one go. And for a very long period of time, women, in fact, had to struggle to get the right to vote. And many other small minorities in many countries, in fact, they also had to wait for their right to vote. If you look at the US, it is the civil rights movements of Martin Luther King, which ultimately saw meaningful political rights being exercised by the African Americans as late as the 1950s, and which actually sort of got materialized into the 1960s. So the story, in fact, is not something which in fact is very old. So political rights, in a sense, it was meant to create this integration amongst people, because they tended to abstract from the givens social rights of individuals, in other words, or social identities of individuals. In other words, what I mean is this, that we all become citizens by virtue of the political rights that we have, but it does not mean that our social identities are lost. We do not lose our social identities, and therefore these different social identities, in fact, are retained by us. But over and above these social identities, what happens is this, that we create, or we have this sense of what could be called what could be called this political right. But unfortunately, even political rights, in fact, were not ultimately very effective in creating the kind of integration that in fact was needed for the forging of the project of the modern citizen. And this was primarily because of the fact that the working class, in fact, a large section of the working class, they could not be integrated, and they remained emotionally aloof from the national project. Because their experience, in fact, demonstrated the fact, established the fact that the exercise of the voting right did not automatically mean that their, it did not automatically mean that their material conditions, in fact, were improving. So this is one. The second, in fact, was this, that look, the working class also remained emotionally, I would say, you know, uh, alienated by virtue of the fact that while, they had social status, but their social status, in fact, was not automatically extended to economic advantages. So in other words, by exercising political rights, they were not necessarily gaining in economic status, and this obviously created a division in society and made the working class accessible to, or made the working class attractive to the ideas of Bolshevism and the ideas of Marxism. And so, in a way, therefore, the solution was to be found from within the broad liberal framework. The solution, in fact, was found through the idea of welfare. And the idea of welfare got concretized through the invocation of social rights, which, in fact, are described as the third generation rights by Marshall. Social rights, as we know, in fact, are material rights. Okay, I mean, they're welfare rights, like the right to work, like the right to pension, like the right to housing, like the right to hospitalization, medical support, These are all different kinds of social rights, and these were also, what you call compensatory rights. In other words, these rights, in fact, were created in order to compensate the economic deficiencies of the working class, so that the working class, in fact, could overcome their emotional alienation and now can forge themselves, can become a part of the citizenry. And broadly speaking, the conclusion, in fact, was that this project, in fact, was by and large completed by the 1950s. So that by the 50s and the 60s, if you look at West European countries, you find that there was a kind of a general consensus that idea of the modern citizenship as a project of integration, in fact, has been completed. Now, the transformation begins from the 1970s, as I told you. And the transformation very broadly begins because of a number of developments. Okay, I mean, part of the development I have already referred to, which in fact is the arrival of immigrants from Asian and African continents, who in fact were very different culturally, and therefore there was this whole question of whether these people could be, assimilated or not. There was a realization that they cannot be assimilated. So there was this huge question of what happens to the citizenship project then. So how would these people be integrated now into the framework of common citizenship? Now, the second, thing that emerges, in fact, would be some groups from within the Western societies. Now, these groups, in fact, are not immigrant groups. Okay, I mean, so these groups, in fact, were groups that, in fact, had remained in the West or in Western societies for a long time, but they were now gradually becoming more, more vocal. They were gradually becoming more transparent, and they were now, you know, uh, politically mobilizing. Who were these groups? So the first group that I draw your attention to, in fact, would be groups who challenge the norms of the who challenge the norms of heterosexuality in life. In other words, the gays and the lesbians. So people with very, different sexual orientation, who in fact who in fact began to make the claim that they must be accepted by the society as normal people. Okay, I mean, so their claim, in fact, was that of normalization. Their claim, in fact, was that of dignity. Their claim was that of respect, which in fact they thought was denied to them by the wider society, because the wider society, in fact, was wrongly prejudiced against them. The second group that I draw your attention, in fact, would be certain religious communities. Okay, I mean, like, you take the Jews. Now, the history of the Jews in the West, in fact, is a very convoluted history. It's a very complex history. I would rather not take you into that today. But my point is this, that if you look closely to the Jews, you find that even after the horrendous experience of the Second World War, the Jews, in fact, had problems of integration in many European countries. Okay, I mean, and as a result, you find that many Jews, in fact, they thought that they were discriminated. But the problem is that the Jews, in fact, were discriminated, or they had a sense of discrimination or a sense of alienation, not because they were poor. On the contrary, Jews, in fact, were very rich. So their problem, in fact, was not of economic deprivation, but their problem seemed to be one of cultural, marginalization, or a kind of cultural, what could be called rejectionism. And they began to, therefore, demand proper integration. They began to demand, commensurate rights, so that they could be respected, and their position, in fact, got the kind of recognition that they deserve. The third group, in fact, would be the Arabs. Now, the Japanese and the Arabs. Now, the historical timings are a bit different. Now, there was a substantive Japanese immigration, particularly in the U.S. in the in the middle of the from the middle of the 19th century onwards. But then the Japanese, in fact, they obviously became, as a community, as a group, became problematic after the experience of the Pearl Harbor and the war that the Americans, in fact, had in the during the Second World War with Japan. And as a result, for a considerable period of time, the Japanese found it very difficult to integrate. And again, the problem that these Japanese, in fact, they had, in fact, was that they were, Japanese Americans. So let us be very clear about that. So they were citizens of the US. But they, again, they found cultural prejudice, and they found that many white Americans, in fact, they were very skeptical of them, and they were not ready, in fact, to embrace them or to accept them as full-fledged American citizens. And so these Japanese, in fact, they had to mobilize, they had to claim what would we call proper cultural recognition. And the Arabs, if you look at it, the Arab immigration obviously happens a lot later, from the 80s. But the Arabs, whether you were looking at the American continent, or whether you were looking at Europe, the Arabs, in fact, obviously, I mean, they did not have any problem of wealth. I mean, they were very rich people generally. But again, the problem, in fact, was that the white societies were skeptical of them. The white societies were not accepting of them, and this skepticism and this lack of acceptance obviously was very deeply a matter of culture. Okay, I mean, so it was partly religious, it was also partly cultural. So if you add all these things, what we find is this, that from the 70s onwards, there is a new realization that rights are not only needed for integration, but rights can also be needed for the security of difference. Or in other words, there is this new notion of difference rights that in fact come up in the vocabulary of politics for the first time. And these groups that I've just talked about, whether you were looking at the gays or you were looking at, the minority, religious communities, or some of the indigenous, people who in fact had been neglected for a very long period of time, exploited and marginalized for a long period of time. Now they began to, very broadly, they began to, ask for, cultural recognition. They began to ask for, cultural rights, in this, in this period. Okay, I mean, and this becomes even more. I think this demand becomes even more strong uh, as you move into the late 80s and early 90s with the fall of socialism. Because with the fall of socialism, what happens is that there is an unmistakable change in the terms of political debate. The earlier terms of political debate was almost overwhelmingly dominated by the debate between liberalism on the one hand and socialism on the other, or liberal capitalism on the one hand and Marxist socialism on the other. But with the fall of socialism in the Soviet Union and across East Europe, the terms of the debate begins to shift. And when the terms of the debate begin to shift, what we find is that the issues of identity, the issue of culture, they began to assume far greater significance. Okay, I mean, so these could no longer be put, I would say, pushed under the carpet. They deserved attention. Sorry. And they had to be therefore given their due recognition. So it is in this context that the supporters of multiculturalism, in fact, they began to draw up a very critical distinction. And the distinction is the following. I mean, they began to make the argument that look, in every society, there are two hierarchies that occur simultaneously. The first hierarchy, in fact, is the hierarchy of class. Now, class, we all know, is a sociological category which, in fact, is defined by economic status. And so the class differences are the conventional differences between the rich on the one hand and the poor on the other. Or you can think of a tripartite class model where the rich and the poor, in fact, are mediated by the middle class. But this distinction, in fact, is essentially what is called a distinction in terms of economic, category, or this is the distinction of class. Now, the politics commensurate to this distinction, in fact, is the traditional politics that, in fact, had prevailed in 20th century, which is very broadly described as the politics of distribution or the politics of redistribution. The idea being that the subject of this politics, in fact, are the economic classes or class-like sociological categories. The aim of the politics, in fact, is to reduce class differences. And the nature of the politics, or the method through which this could be done, in fact, would be through redistributive taxation and other kinds of subsidization that modern states, in fact, are capable of implementing. So, in other words, I mean, the problem that we find, in fact, is the problem of traditional class, what we call politics, and the nature of traditional class politics, in fact, is about doing away with the differences in the distribution of wealth, creating a more just, economically equal society. Okay, I mean, so that there, a society where there would be meaningful economic opportunities to all people, so that people, in fact, would be able to, join the race of life, in a level, on a, in a, in a fair way, in a fair manner, on a level playing field. So, politics of class is essentially about economic leveling. And how do you achieve economic leveling? I mean, this is much more amenable to policy intervention, much more accessible to policy intervention, because you can design progressive taxation policies. You can also design other economic measures. You can, you know, uh, create a whole set of welfare infrastructure through which the economic differences, in fact, can be gradually reduced in society. But alongside the axis of, or the, what could be called the vertical axis of class, there is the other axis in society, which is called the axis of status. Now, status is broadly about recognition. It is broadly about cultural and social recognition that people, in fact, have. And what we have to understand is this, that while there can be some overlap between people who are at the bottom of the class hierarchy and people who are at the bottom of status hierarchy, but these hierarchies, in fact, are not reducible to each other, because there are many instances and many examples which, in fact, would show that people who do pretty well on the economic hierarchy, unfortunately, are not doing well on this social hierarchy or on the status hierarchy. And people who, in fact, do well on status hierarchy may not necessarily do very well in the other hierarchy, or on the other hierarchy, which is, the economic hierarchy. I mean, just to give you examples again, to bring back the examples, if you look at the gays in the United States. So, the gay rights, in fact, they become gradually, significant rights from the 1970s onwards. And if you look closely, the gays, in fact, their average income was much higher compared to the mean income of the Americans. So therefore, one cannot really make the argument that the gays, in fact, were invariably poor. Now, some gays could be poor, but on average, the gays, in fact, they were much richer than the average American, and their demand, in fact, was not of economic parity. Their demand, in fact, was to make society aware of the fact that their sexual orientation, in fact, was different from the sexual orientation of the general society. But they demanded normalization. They very broadly made the argument that while heterosexuality, in fact, is the normal, natural standard in a given society, but there are people who do not belong to it, there are people who do not subscribe to it, and they should not be looked upon as abnormals. They should not be, dealt with disrespect, and their basic dignity, in fact, must be secured by law. So, if you are looking at the Jews, or you were looking at the Japanese, or you were looking at the first generation Indians, or you were looking at others, you would see what you would see, that these people, in fact, would very broadly be clamoring for, demanding the recognition of their cultural attributes, recognition of their cultural difference. Okay, or women, for that matter. In fact, I mean, feminism, to a large extent, in fact, develops as a movement that demanded very special kinds of rights for women. So, in other words, this new politics that we witness is called politics of recognition, which, in fact, is different from the politics of class. Politics of recognition involves, cultural groups. They involve identity groups, and it is essentially about the upward revision of cultural recognition in society. In other words, how can groups, in fact, be, how can groups which, in fact, had been disrespected in society, their identities, in fact, had not been, recognized positively in society, gain positive recognition. So, politics of recognition is a kind of politics of dignity. It is about gaining dignity in life, and this dignity cannot be only interpreted in terms of economic status, because in many cases it is not about gaining economic status, it is not about gaining, ascendancy on the economic hierarchy, but rather it is a question of gaining ascendancy, gaining recognition on the status hierarchy. Because in many cases, we would find that society, the majority of society, in fact, they would not provide the kind of positive recognition that these groups, in fact, were demanding for a whole surfeit of reason, for a whole, what I would call, for a whole set of reasons. So, in a way, therefore, we find that this is the very broadly the very, context of multiculturalism. Or this is how multiculturalism as politics, as of the politics of multiculturalism, in fact, it begins. Now, the next section that I'm going to discuss very broadly, in fact, is the liberal framework of multiculturalism, and then I'll also, draw your attention to some of the limitations of multiculturalism, and I will end. So, if you look at the dominant perspective that you have, in fact, or the dominant debate, it is with regard to the, liberal perspective, let's say, of multiculturalism. And the question there is that what can liberal societies do when it comes to culture? How liberalism, in fact, or how liberal societies, in fact, should look up or should, look at culture. Now, the major theoretician here is Will Kimlicka, who, in fact, is a kind of what could be called central, figure. And in his books, particularly in his second book, Will Kimlicka, in fact, made a very significant, what you call contribution, to the debate. And I would very briefly talk about what his, points are, because he is the standard against which the debate, in fact, has actually happened. So, if you are very broadly, looking very closely, then what we find is this, that look, Kimlicka very broadly, he begins by making the argument that, the conventional presupposition that the liberals, in fact, had against multiculturalism, in fact, was wrong. Now, conventionally, liberals, in fact, had been wary of multiculturalism because of two reasons. First is that many liberals thought that no special rights, in fact, needed to be given to minority communities, indigenous communities, tribes, and other groups, because they thought that the conventional liberal method of privatizing culture, in fact, was good enough for them. Okay, I will just explain what privatization of culture is. Privatization of culture very broadly means that in every society there is a majority and there are minorities. The majority's culture, in fact, becomes the national culture, but the minority cultures, in fact, are given due protection. So the minority cultures, in fact, they deserve toleration and they must be tolerated. But when it comes to national holidays, when it comes to the symbols, when it comes to the major cultural practices, it is almost automatic that the national culture, in fact, is the culture of the majority. And for the minority communities, what the liberals, in fact, have prescribed for a long period of time is the notion or the idea of privatization of culture, which means that they are free to exercise their cultural rights in their private sphere. But they cannot really bring their cultural symbols and they cannot practice their culture in the public sphere, because if they do so, there can be, there can be difficulties, because many of their cultural beliefs, many of their cultural attributes may not be in sync with that of the liberal, what you call, cultural practices. And the second, skepticism that liberals, in fact, have had when it comes to multiculturalism, in fact, is this: they thought that by bringing issues of identity, by bringing issues of culture in the vocabulary of politics, in fact, would lead to the politicization of identity and politicization of culture, which in fact would create, unmanageable differences and fault lines in society. So this would be, this would go against the, the politics of, again, national integration, without which the liberals in fact thought that a modern society in fact cannot survive. But Will Kimlicka, in fact, very broadly sort of says that both these, liberal presumptions, in fact, are mistaken. Now, the first mistake, in fact, is this: he says that, look, the idea that, minority cultures, in fact, can be, dealt justly by privatization is wrong, for the simple reason that the, the culture, in fact, is not something which is a matter of choice, but culture, in fact, according to Kimlicka, is a very context of choice. In other words, whatever choice we make in life, these choices, in fact, are not culturally neutral. In other words, our choices come articulated through the cultures into which we are socialized. So, therefore, privatization of culture is a very weak response. Okay, and it also creates unfortunate, division in society between the majority, who in fact, are valorized, who do not pay any cost, and the minority, who in fact would have to pay a lot of cost just for ensuring the survival of their culture. So the Kimlicka therefore says that we need to therefore move away from privatization of culture, and we have to therefore bring culture into the public sphere. The second argument that Kimlicka says is this: that he says that, look, to bring the issues of culture, in fact, is not to inevitably politicize culture. And politicization of culture, secondly, is not something negative. Rather, politicization of culture is something that we need if we have to protect the interest of the minorities in the genuine, true sense of the term. Because in cultural matters, like any other, matter in life, ultimately decision making is controlled by the weight of majority, or decision making, in fact, is ultimately controlled by the majority. So unless the minorities, in fact, are genuinely represented in the decision making body, there is no way that the minority, conceptions of life, or the way of life, the cultural, ideas, or the cultural choices that the minorities would wish to make, they can be protected. In other words, unless, we create, through intervention, we create spaces for the minorities politically, or we politically empower the minorities, there will just be no way that their cultures, in fact, can be protected in life. So, accordingly, what Kimlicka is doing, if I'm, making sense, what Kimlicka is doing is that, he has redefined the justifications, the liberal justifications of culture, and he has done it in two ways. And these two justifications are important, and I want you to understand these justifications very clearly. The first idea that Kimlicka says is this: that he says that liberals sometimes mistakenly equate group rights with collective rights. So Kimlicka says that, when he is, when he is professing group rights for cultural minorities, when he is saying that without group rights, cultural minorities, in fact, would not be able to survive, or cultural minorities, in fact, would cannot be treated fairly. He is not saying that groups, in fact, would become the holders of entitlement, or groups, in fact, would be the loci of rights. Group rights, according to Kimlicka, are also individual rights, but they have to be understood differently. Group rights are needed not because a group is more authentic than an individual. An individual is more authentic within the liberal, cosmology, within the liberal framework. But individuals finds groups essential for their flourishing. So, in other words, there is an instrumental sense in which groups are absolutely pivotal and absolutely significant for the flourishing, for the betterment of individuals. for the growth of individuals. So without these groups, without the survival of these groups, the individuals in fact would not be really able to do the best for themselves. So if groups are important to individuals, the survival of these groups, therefore, they become absolutely pivotal, absolutely vital. And without rights, these groups cannot survive. So this is the first justification that Kimlicka in fact is giving, which is that equality requires that groups which in fact are backward, groups that are disadvantaged, they are compensated by rights. When it comes to economic backwardness, we know compensation is through welfare rights, or economic compensation in fact is the solution. When it comes to culture, the compensation is through group rights, which in fact are rights that are specifically targeted to minority communities. Now these could be special educational provisions, these could be special provisions so that they could be, so that they could socialize their children in the vernacular. This could be about exemptions from rules that apply to the majority community. They can take various forms. But the crux of the matter is, at the bottom, at the very center, is the idea that if groups are backward, they are not only backward economically, but they can also be backward culturally. Culture matters as much as economic opportunities mattered in life. Because if you look closely to economic opportunities cannot be completely abstracted from the cultural material in which these economic opportunities are ultimately articulated. Think of jobs. You need language for jobs. How can jobs be completely dissociated, separated from language proficiency? Just to take one example. So, in other words, if you are looking into the materiality of life is both economy and culture. So, you just cannot say that culture is a matter of choice. But for Kimlicka, culture, in fact, is the absolutely, what you call, absolutely, necessary condition of equality in life. The second justification that Kimlicka builds, in fact, is through liberty. So he takes liberty towards a multicultural direction. How does he do it? He says that, look, if you ask this question, what is liberty? Ultimately, liberty is important for individuals because it allows individuals to lead the life of their choice from within. Not only does it allow individuals to lead the life of their choice from within, but it also allows individuals to reflect, it also allows individuals to revise their conceptions of life if they realize that their chosen path of life is not necessarily the best life for themselves. Now, all this requires that the way of life that an individual has chosen, in fact, has respect. If a way of life does not have respect, then it is not worthwhile, in fact, as a choice. In other words, your cultural choice has to be meaningful. And your cultural choice can only be meaningful provided it enjoys the respect in the wider society. It is not only a question of your respect, which obviously is there, but it is also a question of respect from the wider society, because unless it is respected by the wider society, it becomes very difficult for you, it becomes very difficult for an individual to pursue it. In other words, autonomy, which is a very central value, is ultimately predicated on respect. And if autonomy is predicated on respect, it is also equally important for us to understand that it also involves, and this is a very important point, it also involves, the inevitability of culture, because there is just no way that we can think of any conception of life without invoking the material of culture. Or we cannot simply imagine a way of life, any conception of the good, from a position of cultural neutrality. Because culture, in fact, is the material by which our idea of the good life, in fact, is constructed. So, in other words, if you have, if I've been able to put across the argument that Kanlika, in fact, is making, the dominant idea, which is the liberal idea of multiculturalism, in fact, is to prescribe, a group of specific or group differentiated rights aimed at different minority groups. And the justifications are both from the standpoint of equality or equality of opportunity, and also liberty. which very broadly sort of says that an autonomous life cannot be a culturally, what you call, vacuous life. It must be culturally defined life. So these are very broadly the justifications that Kimlicka in fact makes. But my point is this: that if you look closely to the liberal traditions, then Kimlicka's position in fact had been criticized both by the conventional liberals on the one hand and more stronger egalitarian liberals on the other. Okay, and I'll just very briefly touch upon two criticisms, and both of these in fact are criticisms that come from within the liberal family. One by Chandan Kukathas, who in fact makes a laissez-faire privatization argument against Kimlicka's notion of multiculturalism, and the equality of treatment argument, which in fact comes from Brian Barry, who in fact is a strong distributive, liberal egalitarian. Let me put these things very simply so that you understand them without any difficulty. Kukathas makes the argument that Kimlicka, group differentiated rights are unnecessarily intervention, they're meddling. And they're also not fair to the illiberal groups, because illiberal groups, in fact, they are terrified by the prospect of autonomy. They do not want any kind of, what you call, any kind of interference by the, by the supporters of liberalism. In other words, Kukatha says that all that is needed to treat cultures fairly in life, in fact, is to give all groups the right to the freedom of association. In other words, Kukathas is saying that culture is not important to liberalism. What is important to liberalism, in fact, is the fact that individuals are able to exercise their right to culture, which can only be done by, or which can be sufficiently, assured through the conventional right to association. Now, if you pay attention to the conventional right to association, then it is not only a right which allows an individual to associate, but more importantly, it is also a right to dissociate. So if you are not happy with a particular cultural association today, you can join another association tomorrow. Now, this is very broadly an idea which actually makes a comparison, or it uses the analogy of the free market on the one hand and the free market of culture on the other. Okay, or a free economic market on the one hand and a free cultural market on the other. So if you look at the laissez-faire idea of the free market, the idea is that consumers are sovereign because they can pick any item that in fact is available in the market. So the items which the consumers in fact they choose, these items in fact are, they become popular, they survive. Items which the consumers reject, they are ultimately lost. Similarly, in the matters of culture, the associations or the cultures that people in fact choose, individuals choose, in fact are the forms of culture that in fact would survive and flourish, and those that people would reject would ultimately be lost. And Kukatha says that liberalism in fact should not be sentimental about what gets lost through individual choices. So individuals are ultimately making choices through the associational freedom. They are picking cultures that they like, they are rejecting cultures that they do not like. And if you are looking at what happens within a cultural association, that Kukatha says must be left to the cultural association itself. So the practices can be liberal, but it is ultimately left to the association itself. So the state should not interfere, should not get into the ways of illiberal practices, but rather should leave these associations, in fact, to practice their values, to practice their orientations, to practice their, to practice their, calling according to the standards, according to the beliefs that these groups, in fact, they have. This is Kukathas's argument. If you look at Brian Barry, Barry says that group differentiated rights are problematic because they violate the very notion of the equality of persons, which means that they violate the idea of equal respect. Now, why? Now, let me give you the example that Brian Barry in fact gives, because the example, in my opinion, makes it absolutely clear the argument that he has. Now he says that look, if there is a law which says that every motorcycle rider would have to wear a crash helmet, then Sikhs cannot claim any exception to this law because they happen to wear turbans. And the wearing of the turban, in fact, is not an article of fashion with the Sikh, but it is mandated by their religion. In other words, what Bedi in fact is saying is this: he says that look, the Sikhs cannot complain that there is any prejudice against the religion in society because they have as much of the religious freedom as any other religion in society. The only thing is that the Sikhs, in fact, should not ride motorcycles, because if they ride motorcycles they cannot use the crash helmet, because you cannot both wear the crash helmet and the turban together. So the point is this, that it is a matter of simply keeping to the law. So the Sikhs cannot be given the right to violate laws when other groups in societies, in fact, they are allowed, in fact, or they must carry these rights, okay, or they must follow these rights. In other words, Barry, in fact, is very broadly saying that look, I mean, the wearing of the helmet is not something which is liked by every person, but it is a law which in whose justification is absolutely unexceptional, because the justification is that we use helmets so that we are able to save our lives. It is a life saving device, and so therefore there is no way that any more significant cultural justification can be made for making an exception to the rule. In other words, Bailey's argument, in fact, is this: that the moment you give specific group rights to minority communities, you provide them with more rights compared to the other members of the population. In other words, in a sense, you are giving them double rights, a set of rights that every citizens enjoy, but another set of rights which only the minority communities, in fact, would enjoy. Now, this, according to Berry, in fact, is unacceptable. It is wrong because it goes against the liberal commitment to the idea of equal respect of persons, or equal dignity of persons. Now, the argument ultimately is that look, I'm not going to I'm not going to invoke what I would call the uh, non-liberal perspectives of multiculturalism in today's lecture, because it's going to take a lot of time, and I would be very happy to get to it in the question answer session. But my point to you is this: that the whole debate seems to be evolving around two things. One is that how do you understand culture, and how do you understand the role of culture in life? So there are liberals like Kukathas, there are liberals like Barry, who in fact very broadly says that culture is, after all, secondary to human life. It is not something which is absolutely essential to human life. Human beings, more significantly, human beings, in fact, they do not have any claim to any authentic culture, because there can't be any authentic culture. Culture is fluid, culture moves, culture, in fact, is always mobile. And particularly if you look at the contemporary world, today's globalized world, today's digitized world, it is very, very difficult, in fact, to keep cultures confined to hermetically sealed containers in life. So cultures, in fact, have become almost sort of by definition, cultures, in fact, have become mobile. And more importantly, if you look closely, the argument, in fact, is this: that culture is a matter of choice. What kind of culture you wish to do depends on what kind of a conception of life you have, and that conception of life ultimately tells you what is the more important element of a culture, because a culture, in fact, is invariably a combination of many things. So you cannot also define culture by a very single kind of an axis. Cultures are always mixed, cultures are always diverse, and so therefore what is important, which elements are important to you within this melange of culture, depends on what is the idea of life that is valuable to you. But on the other hand, there is the liberal multiculturalist position, of which Kimlicka, in fact, is the most strongest exponent, that says that culture is not a question of choice. Culture is not secondary, but culture, in fact, constitutes the very circumstance, unchosen circumstance of life. In other words, the idea that Kiblika and others, in fact, they say is this, that modern states, even liberal states, in fact, they often tend to be, neutral, let's say, when it comes to questions of culture. But this neutrality is only a facade. In real sense, states are not neutral because states are invested in creating societal cultures. States are invested in creating nationalism. States are invested in creating, a whole series of cultural artifacts and symbols without which it would be very, very difficult, in fact, to create a body of national citizenry. Now, the problem, in fact, is with the minorities. How do the minorities fit in a framework which would be just, which would be fair, which would be respectful of the dignity, and also, would be respectful of the cultural variety, which obviously would differ from one country to the other. The moot point is that the culture of the minority is not the culture of the majority. But just because the culture of the minority is different, it doesn't obviously gives the majority a right to bulldoze, to impose their cultural choices on the minorities. Kimlika broadly believes, or cultural, liberal multiculturalists broadly believe, that we have to be mindful of the kind of rights that we are giving to the minorities. We are giving minorities the right to external protection, which means that the majority community should never be allowed to become hegemonic, so that the minorities are able to prevail, minorities are able to retain the cultures of their choice. But we are not giving them the right against internal dissent, so that these groups, these minority communities, in fact, they cannot simply, they cannot strangulate internal debates, they cannot stop internal debate. In other words, they cannot, they cannot simply, you know stifle internal dissent. If the state is giving a set of liberal rights to all citizens, minority communities must also provide these rights to every member of the community. This has nothing to do with the protection of the minority ways of life. If there is a clash between a chosen minority way of life and the liberal rights that are given to citizenship, then Kimlika, in fact, very broadly says, or liberal multiculturalist very broadly says, that the minority cultural artifacts, or the minority cultural practices that are illiberal would have to adjust to the liberal rights, because the liberal rights are universal. In other words, if you look at the idea of liberal multiculturalism, the idea, in fact, is this, that minorities and majorities, they would have to be given cultural rights. Without cultural rights, they would not really be able to make a sense of the kind of life that they wish to live. But we have to understand that ultimately, if liberalism has to prevail, then some kind of an adjustment would have to be made between the kind of culture, or the kind of cultural choices that groups make on the one hand, and the legal rights that in fact are provided to all citizens by the state on the other. So the question is not of a public private distinction. You cannot simply say that in the public life we are liberals, and in the private life we can be deeply communitarian. That is not the solution, because there is no way that we can make that strong distinction between the private and the public. The solution is something which is debatable, because ultimately the debate, and that is my absolute final sentence, ultimately the debate, in fact, is this, that can we really be multicultural and approach multiculturalism only through the liberal framework? Or is multiculturalism necessarily limited to the liberal way of life? Or we need a multiculturalism which goes beyond liberalism, which can accommodate also non liberal conceptions of life? This is a debate which, in fact, is a continuous debate. This is a debate which is a living debate. This is a debate which is an old debate. This is a debate which is also a contemporary debate. And every generation in every country would have to politically, ultimately negotiate this debate and have to politically decide this debate. I'll stop here and would be very, very happy to take your questions.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir, for giving us your valuable time. And it's really such an enriching session and also through provoking session, sir. So now I'm requesting our audience to ask their question in the chat box or just unmute themselves and ask the question. Okay, sir. Give me some second. I'm just checking it. Pallav asked a question. Shall I read, sir?
No, I've
Can
got it. Okay,
multicultural.
I got it on the chat box. Okay,
Okay.
so Paulo, this is a very significant, important question. And if you look at what is happening across the world today, then the problem seems to be that this is precisely what the the detractors of multiculturalism or the critics of multiculturalism in fact are saying. So they are very broadly sort of saying that multiculturalism in fact has led to such strong identity politics that it is ultimately it is fragmenting society, and it has already fragmented societies, and it has created divisions, and it has created problems that in fact would be very very difficult now to overcome. Now if you look at it closely, there are two kinds of issues that come up here. The first issue in fact is this, that look, much of the problem happens to be related to the new waves of immigration. And if you look closely to these new waves of immigration, or people who in fact have come quite recently, then you find that many of these people in fact they have arrived, and they have also began to in a way take up the jobs and other economic opportunities that in fact were available to the netizens in the past, okay, that were available to the the original inhabitants of those countries in the past. In other words, what in fact has happened is this, that look, this whole strengthening of multiculturalism happened simultaneously with many things. Like, for example, it happened together with the onset of globalization. And we know that what consequences globalization in fact produced. It happened along with the questioning of the loyalty of the state or the legitimacy of the state, the nation state as a project, and the proliferation of a large number of other civil societal institutions that began to question the state from various angles. And third, but not least, it also happened alongside the global decline of the politics of welfare. Now, as a result, what we have to understand is this, that look, conventionally, if you look at the integration of societies was very broadly maintained through a very curious admixture of nationalism on one hand and welfare politics on the other. So these were the two, strategies by which most Western societies, in fact, had maintained some kind of a political and social stability. Now, immigration in waves, in fact, have gradually began to, erode this stability and raise very uncomfortable questions. Okay, I mean, so one set of issues, in fact, was this, that globalization gradually led to the de-skilling of the original inhabitants, and many people, they began to lose their jobs, and when they began to lose the jobs, okay, I mean, and the welfare benefits, in fact, they also began to decline, and the anger, they fell on the newly arrived population, okay, I mean, the new immigrants, because the argument, in fact, was this, that these are the people who, in fact, are taking away our jobs. These are the people who, in fact, are getting all the benefits. And what is happening, in fact, is that, I mean, the benefits that we have historically enjoyed, benefits that we have enjoyed traditionally, the rights that we had enjoyed in the past, we are gradually losing them to the incomers, okay, the new people who, in fact, are coming up. The second problem, in fact, is this, that look, I mean, when it comes to the new immigrants, it is an unmistakable fact that a section of the new immigrants, obviously, they are more into a very radical kind of politics, okay, a very radical kind of religious politics, a very radical kind of identity politics. Now, when the new, apart, a small group of new immigrants, they take to this kind of radicalism and they take to violence, obviously their reception within the larger society becomes much more negative, and people's grievances against this particular small section of the population ultimately translates into an unfortunate grievance against the politics of multiculturalism. So the blame is ultimately put on the shoulders of multiculturalism. The argument that is framed is that it is multiculturalism that, in fact, has unduly and unfairly benefited these communities, and as a result, not only are we now losing economically, but our security is also getting imperiled because of the radicalism that we see within a certain percentage of the of this new immigrant population. So therefore, I mean, there is nothing inevitable about multiculturalism or cultural diversity and the destabilization of national identities. But while there is nothing inevitable, there are enough empirical examples to indicate that the politics of multiculturalism is on retreat, or politics of multiculturalism across the world, in fact, has weakened, primarily because of the fact that the detractors of multiculturalism, the opponents of multiculturalism, in fact, have framed the argument that the special rights, special privileges enjoyed by the immigrant communities, enjoyed by the smaller groups, but the minorities, in fact, they are largely responsible for fragmenting society, for dividing society. So therefore, the point that you were raising, I mean, whether it can lead to the fragmentation of society, in fact, is that it can be viewed as that. It can lead to fragmentation, because identity politics can be very divisive, as we know. Now, how it could be reimagined to avoid it, in fact, is a question to which there is no easy answer, because the debate is ultimately here. Okay, I mean, that is where I ended, which is that there are a number of immigrants and there are a number of minorities, minority communities, and they're not necessarily immigrants all the time. But there are minorities who, in fact, are not very convinced that liberal multiculturalism is what they have demanded, and liberal multiculturalism, in fact, is what can actually satisfy their cultural, what you call demands and cultural needs. So, one response, in fact, could be the response that people like Bhikkhu Parekh and others, in fact, have made, which is to say that we need multiculturalism, but we need to go beyond liberal multiculturalism. So we need to have, a genuine communication of diverse cultures, which in fact would become the framework within which a more stronger multiculturalism, in fact, would grow. Now, what it virtually means is this, that we have to, in some sense, dilute the linkage between liberalism and the values of liberalism on the one hand, and genuine multiculturalism on the other. So you take, for example, assertive individualism. Take, for example, the idea of autonomy. Take, for example, the belief that individuals should be able to reflect, on their own conceptions of life. These are all understood as, very Protestant, very, Christian, very Western, elements of culture, which in fact are not universal. So if you look across Asia, if you look across Africa, there are many societies, there are many communities that do not, give much store to these kind of values. Okay, I mean, so they don't consider these values to be important. They have a much more social, much more communitarian, orientation to life. And if people are more communitarian, if people are much more social, then the kind of multiculturalism that in fact would really be I think be functional and would really succeed would be a kind of multiculturalism that has to seriously question and negotiate the liberal paradigm. Okay, I mean, so there is no easy answer to the question that you have posed, because it is the question which in fact is the one that hangs in the balance. Okay, which is that what is the what is the reimagination? What is this fresh imagination which in fact is going to partly be accommodative of some of the essential liberal entitlements, because surely we don't wish to lose them, but on the other hand, which would be genuinely representative of deep cultural differences, and some of these differences in fact they cannot be accommodated by the liberal framework. So there is no easy answer to the last part of the question, which is a brilliant question. What is the reimagination that we seek? But we are caught in the politics of the reimagination, and we have to see which way the multicultural politics in fact would move. We have to see and wait.
Okay, sir. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Paulo, for your question. And now, anyone else? Okay, sir. I think no one has any doubt. So thank you, sir. So wonderful session, and the owner also. Uh, and now, so let's end off our session with a blessing. And thank you, sir, again. And I individually enjoying this session. So thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, sir.